Margaret swirled her amber brandy in the glass as she sat by the fire. The light from the flames danced through the crystal patterns, sending refractions of light scattering and undulating across the walls of the library. Laying on the intricately carved side table were the torn-up remnants of a letter from one of her confidants down south, explaining her husband's intentions with the young tart he'd been carrying on with, and regarding her family fortune. Margaret was seething. Her hands trembled with rage as she took a deep sip of her drink. She'd always been the puppeteer behind her husband, playing a game of well-designed manipulation, giving enough to keep him out of her life and affairs while maintaining control. But it seemed that this woman had her hooks deep enough in him that he was forgetting who ran the show. It was time he fucking remembered.
"Clara!"
yelled the Baroness. After a moment, a petite and exhausted-looking maid appeared in the doorway. "Yes, Ma'am?"
"Ready my travel apparel and have Hamish prepare the carriage."
"Oh, but it's so late and I think he's in bed and..."
"Well, wake him up."
"Yes, of course, Ma'am."
"And Clara..."
"Yes?"
"Clean up that mess."
"What, sorry?" replied Clara, confused, before Margaret stood up slowly and launched the crystal glass in her hand into the wall and shattered it to bits as she swept out of the room. It was the crack of dawn as the lavish carriage rolled into the tiny rustic village, and the horses' fast canter slowed to a steady walk as they followed the muddy, frost-covered trail to its demise at the ramshackle cottage at the end of town. Margaret looked out of the window with disdain as they ground to a halt. The latch clicked as Hamish unlocked the cab door, releasing the veil of smoke that had cloaked the entire carriage, as Margaret had chain-smoked endless cigarettes throughout the journey. He pulled down the steps and held out his hand as the Baroness descended, wrapped in the last wisps of smoke, and dropped the remnants of her current cigarette at his feet.
"Will I wait, madame?"
he asked, his teeth chattering slightly as he shivered in the biting air, and a little puff of condensation escaped his lips.
"No, go and sort the horses. We don't want them getting cold or sick."
"No, of course not."
Margaret set off towards the cottage as Hamish turned around, rolling his eyes and grinding his teeth to hold back the tirade of insults he wanted to hurl at her, as he shook his frozen hands in an attempt to get the feeling back after riding through the icy winds all night at her behest. Margaret settled herself in a high-backed peeling leather chair in the small lounge room, surrounded by strange and horrifying paintings of all manner of diabolical scenes, and a bookshelf stuffed with dusty tomes, the spines decorated with strange symbols and runic morphemes. The doctor shuffled into the room after hanging her coat.
"So, Margaret, it's good to see you. You look radiant as ever."
You don't,"
replied Margaret, as she raised one eyebrow and took in the doctor, with his greasy hair and crusted pale skin. She wrinkled her nose at the blood splatters that were stained into the cuffs of his white shirt that peeked out from his tweed blazer. He noticed and yanked down the jacket, attempting to hide them from view. The doctor looked embarrassed for a second.
Yes, well, work takes up most of my day. I don't really have time to...
"I don't care, Lyle."
No, of course not. So, drink?
"Brandy, neat."
The doctor walked to the corner and opened a drinks globe, poured out 2 large brandies and placed one next to her as she pulled out her silver cigarette case and parked one between her lips. He swiftly lit it for her with a marble table lighter, sat down at the chair opposite her, took a deep sip of his liquor, and peered at her over the glass.
"What brings you here?"
"It's time."
The doctor looked taken aback.
"Really?
"Aye."
Why now?"
Margaret exhaled a long, white plume of smoke and tilted her head to one side.
"That is none of your business. This is my birthright, and you are on retainer here for whenever I choose to exercise that."
Margaret took a sip of her drink.
"You'll do well to remember that,"
she added in a smooth but threatening tone.
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry,"
replied the doctor, backpedaling, seeming a little flustered. For a few moments they sat in silence, staring at each other, before Margaret finished her drink and held out her glass in a mute order to refill it. The doctor obliged.
So, what do you need from me?
Well, it's a long process, and it's fairly complicated.
Margaret rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair.
Explain.
Alejandra scrambled through the tight tunnels as fast as her already tired muscles could carry her. Her arms burned as lactic acid coursed through every ligament, and she wrenched herself forward. Her glasses were smothered in a thick layer of dust, and sweat dripped into her eyes so she could barely see, but she barely even noticed, as the adrenaline pounding through her body pushed her forwards. Finally, she fell out of the last tunnel and into Limbo's grot. She gasped huge chugs of the clearer air, yanked open her backpack and downed water, tasting nothing but wet mud as it slid down her throat with the mouthfuls of dust she'd been inhaling. Even pausing for a moment, she felt guilty. Her stomach writhed as she thought about how Kian was feeling right now, alone back there. She leaned back against the rock wall, closed her itchy eyes and tried to breathe deeply for a moment, focus her mind and take stock of her body. She knew that as fast as she wanted to get help, she had to make sure she didn't burn herself out with exhaustion. She had to make it back to town. She let out one long exhale and clambered to her feet. Her muscles screamed as she started across the grot. She had hoped she might find Cash or Gianna here. She felt so bad for leaving Kian alone and helpless. She desperately wanted to send someone or go back to be with him herself. She couldn't even imagine what he must be going through right now. She tried not to let the guilt fog her mind. She checked her watch and figured at least, even with Tom injured, one of them could be most of the way back to town by this time, getting the help they now so gravely needed. As she limped across the cave towards the entrance of the sump, her headlamp illuminated something that's colour clashed against the grey rock. She squinted through the dim glow and jogged towards it. It was Cash and Gianna's backpacks. Her stomach dropped as she picked up the note resting on top of it.
Thought we heard Tom. Went to check it out. Hopefully back with him soon. Cash.
Joder!
Alejandra dropped to her knees by the crack the bags lay next to.
Cash? Gianna?
She yelled into the void. She listened a few moments, but there was no response. She tried shouting again,
Cash? Gianna?
but was left in silence. She squeezed the bridge of her nose for a second. The situation was spiralling into a bigger and bigger mess. She knew she could not lose her head, but she could feel the weight of the earth upon her shoulders. She had no time to waste, but the group being splintered like this was making it more and more dangerous for all parties, every new issue making a decision harder. She knew from her years as a caver that depending on the space Kian was in, he was at risk of quite literally running out of air and succumbing to hypoxia from high carbon dioxide levels in the small space. One thing was clear. They needed help. She had to keep going. She grabbed a pen from the front pocket of her bag, flipped the note and scribbled a hasty reply.
There was a cave in near where we left you. Kian is trapped. I had to go for help. As soon as you find this, get out of the caves.
She paused for a moment and breathed a long sigh before she continued to write, her hand shaking slightly and translating her stress into little wiggles in the letters.
Even if you haven't found Tom, get out. I will head to Viera and come back with help as soon as I can. Call my phone the moment you are outside.
She tossed down the note and did a quick calculation in her head, ripped open her bag again, grabbed a handful of her glow sticks and a spare headlamp battery to leave behind so the others wouldn't be left in the dark, and took off towards the sump.
So, at least 5 on that date. The more trauma, the better.
Yes, that seems to be the way. What's worked before, what they like. The trauma adds to the chaotic, fearful energy. The more energy, the greater the feed. The more power.
Margaret nodded.
And that's it.
Well, no.
What else?
You have to offer something of you, your own blood.
There was a long pause as Margaret understood.
The boy.
The doctor nodded. Margaret downed her drink and breathed out a long, thoughtful breath.
Well, it only makes sense. In a lot of ways, I suppose. Starting with my father arranging my marriage with my pathetic excuse for a husband in the first place.
Her eyes unfocused as she became lost in thought. Details of her life she'd previously questioned began to click into place and make sense in a way that put a whole new spin on pretty much all she'd known since she left her family home. As the cogs in her mind whirred and new truths revealed themselves, she saw her life's map in her mind's eye, freshly inked with formerly hidden roads. She remained lost in thought for an uncomfortably long amount of time. Eventually, the doctor shuffled and cleared his throat. Margaret jumped with a start as she was dragged back into the room.
Yes, have him. He's never been anything more than a thorn in my side and an embarrassment to my family name. I never wanted him in the first place. At least this way he's worth something to me.
Okay. Deliver them here by the alignment. Send him to me, and I'll take care of the rest.
And I presume everything beforehand is my domain?
Yes.
Fine,
replied Margaret, as she stood up from her chair and glided from the room. As the carriage hurtled back to the city, Margaret's mind writhed like a pit of snakes, with plots and plans on how to achieve her malevolent ambitions. The venom in her burned hot, having laid dormant for too long, like the lava that had seared for eons below the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, now unleashed. Her belly scorched with desire to take back all that was owed to her. Now that the decision was made, the wheels were in motion and the floodgates were open. She would tear down the whole pitiful empire he'd built from her fortune. Cash and Gianna hurtled back the way they came. Gianna led the way, moving so frantically and gripping Cash's hand so tight that her nails were cutting into her skin. Cash didn't even notice the pain. She didn't notice much at all. Though she should have been concentrating on getting to safety, her mind was stuck elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of that poor man, pinned like a bug to the wall of that accursed chapel, from her mind. She felt as though she knew him. The fear and horror she felt upon seeing his mangled form as he led her to that terrible place had been replaced and fully overridden by an extreme sadness and a need to know more. Who was he? In the empty men's toilets at the back of the station, a steam whistle screamed through the air, signifying the train's imminent departure. Lachlan glanced over his shoulder to check no one was coming, and leaned down to plant a soft kiss on Ion's full lips. Ion reached up a hand and grabbed his shirt collar. He pulled him closer, and the soft kiss turned into a heavy makeout as Lachlan lifted his hand to caress the side of his love's face, feeling his stubble brush against his fingertips. Just then, there was a loud creak as the door flung open behind them, and Lachlan jumped backwards, rolling his ankle painfully as he scrambled to get away and act as though nothing had happened. Ion's cheeks flushed red as the arousal of moments before turned to fear immediately. Their co-worker, Shanks, stood in the doorway, immediately recognisable even in the dim early morning light from his long brown coat covering his strange birdcage silhouette. He took a few small steps backwards. He wore a strange and slightly shocked look on his face as the scene he'd just interrupted sunk in. Without saying a word, he slowly closed the door and disappeared.
Shit,
said Lachlan in a panicked tone.
Oh, shit.
He began to pace back and forth.
What are we going to do? I don't know,
replied Lachlan, wringing his hands. The steam whistle rang through the air again, and station bells chimed to announce the hour.
I have to go. Yeah, I'll push you to the train. No, I don't think that's a good idea. Right. Fuck.
Ion wheeled himself to the door and pushed it open. He turned and whispered,
I love you. Yeah, you too. I'll see you soon.
Ion nodded and vanished through the doorway, worry coursing through his body as his mind flashed with the terrible things he'd seen happen to his friends who'd been caught with their boyfriends. Everything from the trial of Oscar Wilde to his own cousin who'd been locked up and sentenced to hard labour. His body shivered as he hoped against what he knew, the chance that Shanks might not do anything about what he'd seen. As the train rolled out of the station, Ion leaned his head against the cold window and felt it bounce and vibrate against the side of his head as he stared out into the miserable grey morning, his mind still racing and his hands twitching in anxiety. As the sandstone buildings gave way to rolling green hillsides, the door of his compartment slid open. Ion pivoted his head in response to the noise, and his stomach dropped as he saw Shanks standing there. He quickly turned his head back to the window as he heard the man manoeuvring his awkward frame into the little cubicle. Ion felt his chest tighten as he screwed his eyes shut, unclear what he should do. He wished the man would just leave. Instead, he felt the seat dip next to him as he sat down beside him. For a few moments they sat in silence, the carriage filled only with the sound of the old train rocking back and forth. Then Shanks spoke.
It's okay, son. I won't tell anyone what I saw,
he said as he slowly placed a gnarled, stained hand on Ion's shoulder. Ion breathed in and out hard and fast as fear pulsed through his entire being. He pushed himself further back into his seat, pressing his shoulder against the window as beads of sweat began to form on his brow. Shanks ignored his agitated demeanour and slowly edged into the seat next to him, wincing and letting out a small groan of pain as he arranged the cage around his ribs into as comfortable a position as possible.
I promise. The secret's safe with me.
Ion turned his head slightly as he felt strangely comforted by the sincerity in the gruff man's voice. He saw that Shanks' face was etched with genuine concern and care. He didn't really understand.
Why?
He stammered, turning to the window and avoiding eye contact. Shanks let out a long sigh.
You know, once upon a time, I was a church-going man. I was really into that shite. Read the Bible every morning, prayed every evening, went to the chapel any chance I could get. Thought of my priest as the ultimate authority on anything and everything. Made every decision based on the teachings.
He stared off into space for a moment, as though lost in a distant memory.
Anyway, that just made sense to me. Made my life easier. I didn't have to think for myself or make any decisions, because I had a manual that told me how things should be. And that was all very well, until something came up that challenged the status quo.
What happened?
Asked Ion, less scared, more intrigued. Shanks breathed out another long sigh.
I let someone down that I loved very much. My eldest daughter, Ainsley.
How?
I abandoned her.
Once again they sat in silence with just the rumble of the train shaking around them. Shanks leaned forward a bit, the bars of his cage squeaking a little under the tension, and rubbed his temple.
You know, she was really special. When she was born, well, I think that might have just been the happiest day of my life. I still remember it like it happened yesterday, holding her in my arms for the first time, grasping my thumb with her tiny little hand. They're memories I don't think could ever become less vivid in my mind. And as she got older, she turned into such a wee character. She was just like me, always getting into mischief. She was a real rough and tumble wee lass. She never fit the mould anyone wanted. A law unto herself, that girl.
He had smiled to himself as he reminisced, but abruptly his face changed, his eyebrows furrowed, and his expression warped into one of a pained sadness.
Anyway, one day she was late home, and I was a bit pissed off, since her ma had been worrying sick. So I went out looking for her and found her on the end of our street kissing someone. I presumed at the time it was some oik of a lad But when I grabbed him to have words, well, it was a little lass. And, well, I blew my top.
Shanks stared ahead of himself as the scene he'd played over and over again in his head for years once again fired up and started rolling by his mind's eye. A sadness overtook him, and even Ion could feel the grief emanating from his aura. Ion rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. Shanks sighed heavily as he blinked back the tears waiting at the corners of his eyes.
I dragged my girl home by the scruff of her shirt and told her she was never to see her again. Quoted stupid things, that bloody book, and told her she was an abomination in the eyes of the Lord, blindly following words written by men locked in stone buildings, isolated from the world centuries ago. I got the priest to come and try to exorcise the inversions in her.
Shanks breathed out and felt his throat ache as he held back a sob.
He tied her to the bed and told us to starve her to lure out the succubus that had tempted her into the sin of vice. He burned her with pokers
Get out, unclean thing!
and rubbed salt into the wounds. He said he needed to cleanse her tainted
May
spirit.
the fires cleanse your wickedness. You must pay for your sins.
It was the most awful thing I've ever let happen.
A tear rolled down his right cheek.
You know, people find the church and use it as a place to atone for their prior sins. Well, I will spend the rest of my life trying to do penance for the heinous things I did while I was in it. I don't think I could ever make amends or be forgiven for what I did. Anyway, of course, she left the second she could, and I never saw her again. But I think about her every day. I had years to think about it all. I think I was in shock for a while, in denial, that it was all my fault that she was gone, that I was responsible for anyone, let alone my own flesh and blood, someone I loved more than anyone else in the world, for them suffering. All she did was find someone to love in this miserable world, and I punished her for it, let her be physically harmed for it.
Shanks swallowed another choke of sadness, forced it down into his belly, and wiped his eyes with a dirty hand.
I swore to never be that person again, to do better. I truly hope that you and your love live a long and beautiful life together and make each other happy every day. I wish the world was a more accepting place for you.
Ion stared at the broken man in front of him and felt the sincerity in his words brush his soul, longing for a brief moment for his own family to feel the same way.
Thank you.
Replied Ion, before they shared a momentary embrace. Kian's body trembled involuntarily as he lay trapped, helpless and swaddled in the darkness. He'd lost all sense of time. He lay immobile, prey to the cyclic waves of all-consuming terror. He felt as though the entirety of his existence was piled on top of him, left in the void of nothingness. His ears burned with the muffled silence all around him. He tried to hum to fight its intensity. Kian faltered. He thought he heard another voice humming along with him. He shook his head and questioned his hearing before he tried again. This time, when he stopped, the other voice continued.
Alejandra?
He stammered, querying his own sanity as his heart began to pound in his throat.
Hello?
But the humming didn't stop. Radisson looked at the tumble-down ancient cottage, piles of junk laid out in the front yard, and wrinkled his nose. He made his way through the trampled grass that passed for a path and stepped up onto the front stair, which bore thick cracks in the stone garnished with twisted weeds and roots. Dangling from the slightly rotted wood front door, decked with flaked green paint, hung a rusted metal knocker designed to look like a bull's head, with a heavy ring swinging from its nose. There was a strange scent hanging in the air that seemed to be emanating from inside the building. It smelled medical. The Baron pulled his scarf up over his nose. He drew a handkerchief from his top pocket and used it to protect his fingertips from the grubby door knocker and tapped out the announcement of his arrival. After a few moments, he heard the tinny clunk of a metal tool being placed onto wood and measured footsteps ambling towards him. The door creaked open to reveal a gaunt-looking man with slicked-back oily hair and curly, close-trimmed mutton chops. His eyes were deep-set and adorned with violaceous, sagging bags. The area around his nose and mouth bore pink sores which flaked bits of crusty skin in patches. He wore a long, filthy, once-white coat covered in stains of various red, brown and yellow hues. He stank like formaldehyde and ammonia. He looked the Baron up and down in a judgmental manner before he moved to one side and nodded his head as a signal to come in. Radisson tentatively stepped inside. The man closed the door, pushed past him and headed down the hall.
In here,
he said, not turning around to face the Baron, but shoving open a door on his left and walking inside. The Baron followed, into a small room decorated with an old and ink-stained battered desk covered in papers, with a high-back leather chair behind it, and shelves lining every wall, which were stacked from floor to ceiling with ghastly and disturbingly human-looking wet specimens in jars. They hung like ghosts in their brown liquid domes. The Baron felt a shudder run down his spine, and pulled his overcoat tight to his body, as though it would somehow protect him from the grotesque, morbid place he found himself, and wondered why his mother would send him here. The man sat down behind his desk, leaving the Baron standing, and stared at him for a few moments.
You don't look like her. Very weak chin,
he muttered to himself.
What?
The man cleared his throat.
I said, you have a weak chin. Probably inherited it from that mongrel of a father of yours.
Excuse me? Exactly who do you think you...
I think I'm the person who guards the door and holds the key to your mother's plan, and I think you should be careful about the next words that come out of that crooked mouth of yours, if you want to go back to her having been successful in what she's asked you to do.
Alfred shut up, but his eyes glared with the wild anger of the insolence of the greasy old creep. The only person who'd ever spoken to him in such a way was the old crone herself. The doctor smirked.
That's what I thought.
He slicked back his oily hair before removing a large old silver key from inside his soiled white coat and opened the desk. He pulled open the drawer with a grating, scraping sound. He lifted an old, unfolded parchment from inside. He peeled it open slowly and deliberately and placed it on the table, stabbing his finger at a certain spot with far more aggression than necessary.
Gather your horde of riffraff and meet me here.
He jabbed at the paper again.
Tomorrow at 3 p.m.
The Baron leaned forward and looked at the map.
Okay, but how will
Get a carriage,
interrupted the doctor rudely.
Okay, from where?
The mortuary, on the other side of the village. They'll have something big enough.
The Baron could feel a rage bubbling up inside his chest. This man was triggering every impulse he had to spit in his face and throw a fist. He forced it down and felt the fury burn like acid as it slid down his esophagus. The doctor spun in his chair, opened a small chest behind him, rooted around for a few moments and emerged with a jar filled with clear liquid.
Buy some whiskey and pour a teaspoon of this into each bottle and give it to your charges before you arrive.
Okay, and what happens when I get there, to the meeting point?
You do as I say.
And what?
And that's it.
The doctor slid the papers across the desk, and the Baron snatched them up, matching his strange hostile energy.
Okay now, get out.
With pleasure,
responded the Baron, before he turned on his heel and breathed a sigh of relief as he hurried out of the repugnant hovel, shaking his head in both irritation and confusion. The doctor reached back inside the drawer, pulled out a small dark brown coloured glass bottle and popped out the cork before tearing a handkerchief as sullied as his jacket from his top pocket. He poured a healthy dose of the liquid into its folds before holding it up to his face and huffing in deeply. His eyes rolling back in his skull so far they became 2 white orbs, and he sunk into his chair. Margaret settled her finger on the trigger of her ornate round-action shotgun and waited with the patience of a skilled and seasoned hunter. 2 of her servants were up ahead, shaking rattles and hitting at the heather bushes with sticks. Suddenly there was a flutter of activity from under a small thicket, and a pheasant launched himself into the air, clucking in fear. Margaret held her breath, slowly closed one eye, and squeezed. A deafening bang echoed all around as the pheasant let out an agonised crow and fell from the sky with a thud as it hit the mossy ground.
"Oh, great shot, milady!"
yelled one of the servants as they scurried towards the kill.
"Oh, obviously,"
replied Margaret, as she ejected her shotgun shells with a practised hand, snapped the gun back together and slid it into her saddlebag.
"Now go along, get that ready for dinner. I want it ready by 8:30. The Baron will be visiting this evening."
"Oh, yes, madam, of course."
She pulled out her silver cigarette case and a box of matches from inside her fur-lined coat, placed a cigarette between her magenta-painted lips and lit it, breathing in deeply before clicking her heels into the side of her steed and slowly heading back to the house, smiling to herself as she thought about the look on that boar's face when he found out what she'd done. Margaret was settled at the dinner table, already 2 wines deep by the time she heard her oath of a spouse stomp into the room in his usual bluster. He threw himself into a chair next to her and immediately pulled out his pipe and started stuffing it with strong-smelling tobacco. He was a sloppy man, with his beer belly poking out from his roughly tucked shirt.
"Hello, darling."
Margaret rolled her eyes in disdain and moved slightly backwards in her chair. At that moment, the servants entered with a beautifully roasted pheasant and trimmings and placed it down on the table.
"Perfect. I'm ravenous."
"More wine. Now,"
demanded Margaret, as she watched her husband light his pipe, inhale deeply and swill the smoke inside his mouth before letting it go in a stinking puff, and immediately stab at his pheasant with his fork in a crude caveman-like style and shovel it into his mouth. He masticated it in a rough and repulsive manner, and Margaret averted her eyes so as not to stare into the void of half-chewed bird. Before swallowing, he started to talk again, spitting particles of meat across the table.
"Where's Alfred? Haven't seen my lad in ages."
"Well, perhaps you would if you weren't fucking about in London all the time."
"Oh, Margaret, not this again. If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. That's where I need to be for the business. You can't just have me here with you."
Margaret visibly recoiled at the thought.
That couldn't be further from what I want."
"Well, what's the problem then?"
The maid sent to bring more wine arrived and went to pour it into her mistress's glass, but Margaret snatched the whole receptacle from her hand and started to swig right from the bottle.
"The problem is you trying to give away my family's money to that little tart you've been carrying on with."
"How dare you accuse me of such a thing?"
Margaret rolled her eyes again. Her husband finally swallowed the mashed-up hunk of meat in his throat, and a smile twitched at the corner of her mouth.
"Go ahead, lie like you do about everything. I don't give a shit, Clarence. But let me tell you something. That little slut will get none of my money. In fact, you yourself won't be spending a penny more than you've already frittered away. I'm going to destroy everything you've ever cared about. No legacy. No one will even remember you ever graced this planet with your fat, useless arse."
"What the hell are you talking about, you mad bitch?"
"About the fact that I've sent your worthless son to Biera to fulfill the only use he'll ever have."
"What?"
"I've offered him to the caves. It's my time, Clarence."
Clarence furrowed his brow in confusion. Why had he heard that name before? Biera. Caves. Something was ringing a bell in his distant memory. Suddenly, he remembered, and a shudder shot through his whole body.
"You did what?"
he yelled, as the gravity of the situation hit him like a steam train. Clarence jumped up from his seat in a panic, sending his dinner plate crashing to the floor.
"Where are you going?"
asked Margaret, taking another sip of her wine.
"To get the boy before something awful happens to him,"
shouted Clarence, in a tone wrought with anxiety and panic.
"Good luck with that."
The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 o'clock.
"You have about 15 minutes, if you're lucky."
Clarence felt his stomach drop.
"Until what?"
"Until the strychnine has soaked the buckshot in, that I then peppered into that pheasant you just wolfed down like a greedy pig, as I knew you would. Does its work and stops your heart."
Clarence froze. Margaret smiled a cruel smile and took a slow, calm sip of her wine.
"What do you mean?"
"I don't think I could be any more clear, Clarence."
He stayed frozen as his brain tried to receive the information given to him and judge if his wife would actually do something like this. He knew she was a cold woman, but even for her, this was insanity.
"I don't believe you."
"Fine,"
replied Margaret, taking out a cigarette and lighting it. A strange sharp pain shot through his torso. He clutched at his chest and immediately descended into a frenzied panic.
"Help! Help! She's trying to kill me!"
Clarence completely lost his head. He charged at the door in an attempt to find aid. Margaret smirked as he struggled frantically with the door she knew wouldn't open. She told the servants to leave and lock it after they served dinner, as she and their master had some private time planned and she did not wish for them to be disturbed. At that moment, Clarence's legs began to spasm uncontrollably, and he let out a pained groan. Margaret stood up and slowly walked towards him, taking a draw on her smoke.
"Why have you done this?"
"Because, Clarence, you've been a thorn in my side since the moment we met. Because I can't have you trying to save our good-for-nothing son, as his sacrifice is integral to my plan to take back my money and take back my family status. But mostly because I wanted to see you suffer."
Clarence looked up, horrified, enraged and terrified, as his body twitched uncontrollably. He tried to respond, but his jaw was locked shut, and as he tried to choke out his words, he instead began to choke out white froth. He tried to grab Margaret around the ankle, but she smoothly stepped backwards, perched on the edge of the table, and flicked the end of her cigarette onto the floor next to him. Finally, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he let out one final, rattling cough, accompanied by a spurt of white foam that sprayed through his clenched teeth as his body went limp. Margaret stayed where she was, surveying the scene for a few moments in silence. Eventually, she stood up, calmly walked over to him, bent down and wiped the froth from his mouth with the lapel of his dinner jacket, then proceeded to unbutton his shirt and trousers and pull them down to his knees. She removed the pin from her own hair and let it flow down her back, smeared her lipstick with the back of her hand, clicked the door lock open and let out a blood-curdling screech as she launched herself into the hallway. Kian breathed deeply. His body had settled into an almost constant stressed vibration. He tried to focus on the task he'd set himself in his own head of naming the capital of every country in Europe. Anything to not fixate on his situation. As he was struggling to remember the name of the capital of Moldova, his brain once again allowed the humming that he had forced himself to ignore, but that had not stopped since it started, to drift into his ears. He swallowed, and his skin prickled with fear as he considered the thought that he had completely lost touch with reality. He flat out refused to allow his mind to believe that there was actually something making that sound. He knew in traumatic experiences your mind could play tricks on you. But at that moment, the image of Tom and his warning flashed in his head.
"They won't let you leave."
He swallowed and felt his palms start to sweat. He shifted his shoulders uncomfortably in his stone prison. Just then, the humming ceased. He felt momentary relief that he hadn't completely cracked and let out a sigh. and began to reason with himself that maybe the hum was something to do with the blood pulsing in his ears, as he realised how cramped his neck was. He jerked his head sideways and tried to stretch his limbs as much as he could to stop blood pooling elsewhere. It wasn't much, but it was a welcome minor distraction. As he stretched his left arm, his fingertips grazed something that wasn't rock, but cold and metal, and all of a sudden he remembered the thing that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. The fucking thing from the wall. He stretched out his hand again. The very tops of his fingers made contact with a sharp blade edge. Maybe he could use it. He slid his digits upwards, but the handle was out of reach. He slipped his hand back downward to see if he could pull it closer from the bottom, but it was then that his hand hit something else, something squishy. He recoiled slightly. What on earth was that? He reached out again and his hand touched something slimy and leathery. He poked at it tentatively and tried to work out what the hell it was. As he prodded at it again, there was a weird tearing noise and his finger went straight through it. Suddenly, there was the sound of something sliding against rock, and Kian let out a scream as something shot up from below his hand and grabbed his wrist hard. The Entities is a Grim Pickens production, created, written, directed and edited by Kat Clifford, co-edited by Lee M.M., starring Kat Clifford, Alex Chu, Galactom, MC Lark, Jem F., Izzy Matthews, Steve Clifford, Devin Drake and Thomas Shajan Walsh. Thanks for listening. We would also like to make an announcement. We now have a Patreon. We will be posting a link to it on our socials and would love it if you would check it out. And if you're feeling generous and like what we're doing here, we would greatly appreciate you signing up. Also, if you do enjoy the podcast, we would love for you to like and subscribe and tell one friend about us. Cheers!